This is the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you, Lord.
The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews said to him, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But Jesus was speaking of the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scriptures and the word that Jesus had spoken. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
I wrote this sermon sitting in a Starbucks at Winthrop University. I was there the last couple of days as a chaperone with some River Bluff choir students. But I was sitting in the Starbucks thinking about Jesus cleansing the temple. And I started wondering what it would be like if Jesus came into the Starbucks and did there what he did in John chapter 2. Can you picture it? Jesus walks into Starbucks, jumps over the counter, and starts toppling all the coffee makers and the latte makers and the cappuccino makers. Then he grabs all those little pastries in that glass case and throws them on the floor and stomps on them. He breaks the registers and flings the cash and change out into the streets. And then he picks up a chair and throws it across the room and yells at all the people in Starbucks with their overpriced coffee and fancy laptops, "Get out of here!" If Jesus did that, we wouldn't say Jesus cleansed the Starbucks. We'd say he wrecked it. Sometimes we call this story we hear today Jesus cleansing the temple, but cleansing hardly captures the drama. Jesus wrecked the temple. Oh, sure, the leaders who were there in charge of all the stuff Jesus wrecked could have put all the tables and the animals and the money back in place eventually. But in that moment, Jesus completely wrecked what was happening there. So let's think, why in the world did Jesus do that? Well, first, let's remember what the temple was. The temple was the chief place of worship in the time of Jesus. For faithful Jewish people then, the temple was the dwelling place of God. The temple was a sign of God's promise to be present with his people. People went up to the temple to worship God because they trusted God would be there to receive their worship and to receive their sacrifices. The people made trips to the temple at certain times of year to do just this. They would come and they would pay a little money for an animal, and then they would offer that animal as a sacrifice in an act of worship. Now, we shouldn't look suspiciously on that whole temple way of doing things. It was really important in the time of Jesus. The identity of the people of God was tied to the temple, the way God was there. and what people did there for God. It was vital. And then Jesus walked into the temple, and he drove out the animals with a whip, poured out the coins of the money changers, and turned over all the tables. Was it that Jesus was concerned about all the consumerism going on? Did he think that the people selling things were cheating everyone out of money? What motivated Jesus to wreck the temple that day? Well, the story doesn't say exactly, but it seems to have something to do with these verses in the passage. Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." They said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body. There's the temple, and then there's Jesus. The temple, God is present there. It is the place to worship. People's sacred identity is bound to it. And then comes Jesus. And he is the presence of God. He is the one to worship. And people's sacred identity will be bound to him. Maybe the reason Jesus did what he did in the temple is because there was a new temple in town. And the temple is Jesus. When he comes, he is the new temple, the new sign that God is present with his people. Jesus cleansing the temple is just a dramatic way of acting out this new reality. It was a sign. Take note, Jesus seems to be saying. The way you understood God and related to God is about to change. Things change because of Jesus. They are turned over and turned upside down. Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." And that is what happened. For Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body. Jesus, in the flesh, was handed over. Jesus, bloodied and pierced, was hanged on a cross. Jesus' lifeless corpse was placed in the tomb. Jesus' glorious body rose to new life 3 days later. That is what happened. That is what happened to Jesus. That's what his actions in the temple that day pointed to. And what does that all have to do with us? Well, sometimes I think we could read this story and then we could ask ourselves, what needs to be cleansed in our lives to make room for Jesus? I'm not sure the question works as well if I ask, what needs to be wrecked in your life? Still, the story of Jesus in the temple might lead us to wonder, what are the places we believe God is present? What are the ways we worship that bring meaning to our lives of faith? What are the things that are vital to our sacred identity? Is Jesus in the answers to those questions? Jesus wrecked the temple that day so that God's people could begin to rebuild their understanding of God with Jesus as the cornerstone. He wanted to show them that it was him, his body, the body of Christ, that was most important. And I think Jesus wants to show us that too. That God is present with us in the body of Christ. Of course, we use that phrase in at least two ways around here, don't we? We use the words, the body of Christ, to refer to the meal of Holy Communion. And we believe that Jesus is with us, given by God in grace in this meal. We also use the words, the body of Christ, to refer to this congregation. And we believe that Jesus is with us in the community gathered in his name. Of course, it's not just here, in this place, in this room, that Jesus is present. And that's the thing about the story of Jesus wrecking the temple. See, the people of God believed that God was in the temple, and maybe they even believed that God stayed inside those walls. But Jesus came to tear down the walls, to break open the doors, and to smash the windows, to show us a God who doesn't stay put inside our religious spaces, but is loose in the world. So I was sitting there in that Starbucks at Winthrop, and I was kind of waiting to see if Jesus would come in and liven up the place. And then I saw a young man reading a Bible over coffee. And I saw some students working together to learn about God's world. And overheard two teachers talking about how to make schools safer for children. And then I realized, Jesus, you are already here.